There are moments that arrive quietly without announcement, and Bill Gaither's moment came not on a stage, not in a recording studio, and not when another award was placed in his hands. At 89 years old, after 6 decades of writing gospel music that shaped how millions of people understand faith, he finally said out loud what every person who ever wept to one of his songs had already sensed in their bones. This was not a confession designed for headlines. What he admitted was something older and quieter and far more powerful than any headline could hold, and once you hear it, every song he ever wrote takes on a different weight entirely. Bill Gaither grew up in Alexandria, Indiana, and the town itself did a lot of the work of shaping him before he ever wrote a single note. His family ran deep in Christian faith, and gospel music in that household was not background noise or Sunday performance. It was the actual language people used to speak to each other and to God, woven through daily life the way weather is woven through a farming community, always present, always meaningful. Young Bill absorbed all of it without trying to, the way children absorb their mother tongue, and by the time he was old enough to understand what music was doing to him, it had already done most of its work. Christian music, gospel hymns, Southern gospel tradition, these were not things he chose. They chose him first. The path from Alexandria to becoming what the American Society of Composers, authors, and publishers would eventually call the Christian songwriter of the century was not direct, and the detour he took is worth understanding. Gaither became a teacher, an English teacher at Alexandria High School, which says something interesting about the man who would later craft some of the most precise and emotionally surgical lyrics in gospel music history. He was good at it, genuinely good, and he connected with students in ways that required the same attentiveness to language and human need that his songwriting would later demand. But underneath all of that, the songs kept building pressure, and no amount of good work in a classroom fully released it. That tension between the practical life he was living and the creative calling pressing against it from the inside is something a lot of people who loved his music would later recognize in themselves. Gloria Sickle walked into that tension and changed everything. When Bill met her and they married in 1962, what happened next was not simply two people falling in love, though that was real enough. What happened was a collision of two complementary gifts that produced something neither of them could have reached alone. She carried a poet's precision and a theologian's seriousness. He carried a musician's instinct for the emotional arc of a melody, for where a song needs to breathe and where it needs to push. Gloria encouraged him to stop treating songwriting as a secondary occupation and start treating it as the calling it clearly was, and that encouragement did not just redirect his career. It redirected gospel music itself, though nobody quite knew that yet. He Touched Me arrived in 1963, and what made it land so hard in churches worldwide was exactly what made it seem almost too simple on the surface. Those two words at the center of the chorus captured something that most people had experienced and almost no one had found words for, that particular moment in a person's spiritual life when the presence of something greater than yourself stops being theoretical and becomes undeniable. Gospel songwriting had produced many things before 1963, but it had rarely produced something that so precisely named an interior experience that congregants could recognize as their own. When people sang "He Touched Me," they were not performing someone else's story. They were finally singing their own, and the relief of that was visible on faces in pews from small Midwestern churches to major urban congregations. Bill Gaither, Christian music artist, had given the church a language for personal transformation that it did not know it was missing. Because He Lives came from a harder place, and the harder place is exactly what gives it its power. Gloria was pregnant, and instead of uncomplicated joy, both she and Bill found themselves gripped by genuine fear about the world their child was being born into. The late 1960s were fracturing along every line that societies fracture along, and none of that chaos stopped at the doors of devout Christian households. The Gaithers sat with their fear and did not pretend it away, and what came out of that honest sitting was one of the most enduring songs in the entire history of Christian worship. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Those lines were not written from a position of easy certainty. They were pulled up from the same place doubt lives, which is exactly why they have reached so many people in exactly their most fearful moments. Gaither gospel music, Christian hymns, worship songs with staying power, These categories all stretch to contain that song, but none of them fully explains what it actually does to a person when it arrives at the right moment. The King is Coming became a different kind of anthem, one that reminded believers the story they were living inside had a conclusion that the chaos of any given moment could not change or cancel. Something beautiful offered a specific and needed grace to people who felt their lives were too broken for redemption to bother with. Over the decades that followed, he touched me. Song after song after song after song after song accumulated in the Gaither catalog until the total exceeded 700 compositions, and that number needs a moment of honest attention. 700 songs means 700 separate acts of creative and spiritual labor, 700 times sitting down with the intention of finding words and melody equal to something true, and giving that truth away freely to whoever needed it. Very few artists in any genre of music reach anywhere near that number while maintaining consistent quality. The Gaithers did it across 6 decades, and the catalog still holds. What kept the music from aging the way most music ages is worth examining carefully, because the answer is not what it first appears to be. The obvious answer is that the songs are good, which is true, but good songs date all the time. The deeper answer is theological. Gloria and Bill Gaither were not writing catchy expressions of general religious goodwill. Their songs engaged the actual core concerns of Christian faith: personal transformation, resurrection, hope, the promised return of Christ, the grace available to the irreparably broken, with enough specificity and honesty that nothing about them could be dismissed as decoration. Christian music at its best is doing exactly what the Gaithers spent their careers doing, naming the real things and putting them in a form people can carry around inside them. That kind of music does not date, because the real things do not date. The Gaither Homecoming series arrived in 1991 and did something that nobody, including Bill Gaither himself, fully anticipated. The original concept held a deceptive simplicity: gather gospel music legends together, many of them elderly and largely sidelined by an industry that had moved on to newer sounds, put them in a room with microphones, and let them sing and talk, remember, together without theatrical staging or commercial packaging. What came back from that room was something audiences recognized instantly as rare, as the kind of authentic warmth that no production budget can manufacture and no algorithm can replicate. The first Homecoming video spread person to person through the Christian community before viral sharing was a concept anyone had language for, and it grew into one of the most beloved franchises in gospel music history without ever compromising the simplicity that made it work. Southern gospel music, Christian music history, gospel music legends, all of those categories were touched and refreshed by what Gaither built through those recordings. One of the things the Homecoming series accomplished that deserves its own recognition was the restoration of dignity to artists who had given everything to gospel music and then found themselves forgotten. Vestal Goodman, Jake Hess, J.D. Sumner, artists who had carried the tradition when it needed carrying, were brought back to center stage and treated not as nostalgic footnotes, but as the legends they actually were. Younger artists on those recordings genuinely revered them, and you could see it in the footage, see what it meant to older performers to be surrounded by people who understood what they had done and honored it openly. Bill Gaither gave them that, and in giving it to them, he preserved something in gospel music that would otherwise have been lost quietly, irreversibly between one generation and the next. His work mentoring younger artists runs alongside the Homecoming legacy and is equally important to understanding what his career actually was. Mark Lowry, David Phelps, Guy Penrod, Wes Hampton, these names are significant in contemporary gospel and Christian music, and all of them credit Gaither with the platform and guidance that shaped what their careers became. The pattern repeated itself consistently across decades. Find talented people who have something real to give. Give them a stage and support, and the kind of honest challenge that only comes from someone who actually believes in what you're capable of, and then get out of their way. That generosity was never incidental to his success. It was one of its primary engines, and it still drives the music forward through artists he helped build who are now building others. Gloria and Bill Gaither's partnership, 62 years of marriage and creative collaboration running completely in parallel, resists easy description because it has no real equivalent in gospel music or Christian music or most other genres either. Her literary and theological gift gave his musical instinct something worthy to carry. His sense for melody and arrangement gave her words a form that made them live in congregations rather than just on pages. Neither of them is fully explainable without the other, and the music they made together is not divisible back into separate contributions. When a person responds to a Gaither song in a church on a Sunday morning, they are responding to both of them simultaneously, to 60 years of two people thinking seriously about the same things and trusting each other enough to say out loud in music what most people only dare to feel privately. The American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers named Bill Gaither the Christian songwriter of the century more than 2 decades ago, and that recognition lands differently when you set it beside what he has said about his own career. Gloria and I have constantly zeroed in on what the message is. He has put it plainly. The music package is just the wrapper. It carries the message in all different kinds of styles. That articulation is as clean and direct as his best lyrics, and it carries the same quality that makes his best lyrics last. He is not hedging or performing humility. He is describing exactly how he and Gloria worked and why that work produced what it produced. Fame was never the organizing principle. The message was the organizing principle, and the fame arrived as a consequence rather than a goal, which is precisely why the fame never corrupted what the music was trying to do. Gaither Gospel Hour on TBN represents a new delivery system for the same message that has been running through everything since 1963. At 89, launching a television program with the energy and genuine enthusiasm he brings to it says something about a person that no biography paragraph can fully capture. There is something about Saturday night and gospel music, he has reflected, and Sunday morning is time for preaching. But people who follow Jesus on Saturday night need a little gospel music. That instinct, that pastoral attentiveness to what people actually need and when they need it, has been the quiet intelligence behind every project he has undertaken. The show gathers gospel legends and newer Christian artists in the same spirit that animated the homecoming videos, celebrating the tradition while making it genuinely available to people encountering it for the first time. Contemporary Christian music, worship music, Christian pop, these genres have all evolved rapidly through the decades that Bill Gaither has been working, and the survival of his catalog through all of that evolution is not accidental. Modern worship leaders, people who grew up entirely on contemporary sounds, return to Gaither compositions and find in them a depth that more recent productions sometimes traded for sonic sophistication. Churches that adopted every new musical trend kept the old Gaither songs anyway, not out of nostalgia, but because those songs fill a specific need that newer music has not yet found a way to replace. They address doubt and faith and hope and grief and resurrection with a directness that speaks across whatever stylistic gap exists between the decade they were written and the moment they are being sung. The broader impact on how churches approach worship is measurable even where it is not always explicitly acknowledged. Before the Gaithers rose to prominence, many traditional services ran closely to hymnals with limited musical variation. Their introduction of more personally expressive worship experiences, while keeping theological depth intact, opened space for a balance between traditional and contemporary that most healthy churches now take for granted. The homecoming concerts extended that by creating large-scale worship gatherings that crossed denominational lines and reminded thousands of believers at a time that worship does not belong exclusively to any single tradition or building. Christian worship music, gospel concert experience, faith community, all of those things were reshaped by what the Gaithers built through their live events and recordings. His final admission, the one that set all of this in motion, was not a revelation in the sense of something previously hidden coming to light. Every song he and Gloria ever wrote already contained the confession. The music was too honest, too specific about real human experience, too clearly indifferent to the kind of polish that serves celebrity rather than ministry, for it to have come from someone operating with fame as the goal. What Bill Gaither said out loud at 89 was simply the statement form of what the music had been demonstrating in action for 60 years. The songs were always about the person in the third pew who needed to hear something true. They were always about the man driving home from a funeral who needed a melody to remind him that grief is not the last word. They were always about the mother at 3 a.m, exhausted and afraid, who needed the specific promise carried in because he lives to feel like it was addressed to her personally, because it was. Christian songwriter, gospel music pioneer, hymn writer, worship leader, these labels all attached to Bill Gaither accurately enough, But none of them captures the thing that makes his legacy genuinely unusual in the history of American Christian music. What makes it unusual is the consistency. 60 years of keeping the same organizing principle in place while everything around him shifted, while the industry changed its metrics and its expectations and its definition of success, while musical styles evolved and audiences moved and commercial pressures multiplied. He and Gloria held the line on what the music was for, and the result is a catalog that has outlasted every trend that tried to make it irrelevant and will outlast every trend that has not yet arrived. The lives the music has reached are the actual measure of what he built, and they are not countable. The elderly woman in a nursing home who hears "He touched me" and travels back instantly to the moment her faith first took hold. The young worship leader who watched a homecoming video and understood for the first time what gospel music can actually do when it is made with honesty and given away, without reservation. The teenager sitting in the back of a church, bored and restless, who hears a choir sing because he lives and feels something shift in them that they will not have words for until years later. These are the data points that matter in the accounting of a life's work, and by those measures, what Bill Gaither and Gloria built together is one of the most significant creative ministries in the history of American Christian faith. None of that will stop when he eventually steps away from recording and performing, and he knows it. The Gaither Music Company continues producing and distributing the catalog. The Homecoming brand continues drawing audiences. The songs continue being sung by choirs that learned them decades ago, and by young voices discovering them for the first time on streaming platforms. Christian music streaming, gospel music online, Gaither homecoming videos, all of these pathways carry the work forward into context that did not exist when the work was made. And new artists whose careers were shaped by the Gaithers are now shaping careers of their own, passing forward the same generous spirit and the same commitment to message over personal advancement that defined how Bill and Gloria operated from the beginning. At 89, what he looks back at is not a catalog or a trophy case or a television program. What he looks back at is a life organized around a single conviction, that music capable of reaching the person who needs it most is music, made in service of something larger than the person making it. Every song he wrote with Gloria, from the first note of "He touched me" to whatever he writes next, was an act of that conviction in practice. His admission that fame was never the point does not diminish what he achieved. It explains it. The music lasted because it was never about the musician. The legacy endures because it was always about the message. And as long as there are people who need what gospel music at its truest can offer, the song Bill Gaither spent his entire life singing will keep playing in the places where songs live longest, not on charts or streaming dashboards, but in the interior spaces of human lives that needed exactly what it carried and found it there waiting.